Fionn Rawnsley, I mean, he's a gentleman with a long history of all kinds of things. He's an artist, an illustrator, a sculptor. He worked on spitting image. Remember that? Years ago. Okay, so he's got a long background in things like this. But the astrology work has led him to wonder about the heavens and how that related to the ancient landscape. We know of the Glastonbury Zodiac, where many people believe that there are things woven into the landscape that reflect the heavens, but there might be some other bigger ones out there, and the Stonehenge Zodiac is something that he's been looking at and working on. So I'm really glad to have the opportunity to share this with you. So a big welcome, please, to Fionn Rawnsley, wherever he is.
I did the cardinal sin. I left my phone on. Damn. Okay. So, good morning, everybody. How can I kick this off? Well, right. Everybody can hear me at the back, yes? Good. And welcome. I'm going to try and begin by telling you a little bit of a story before I delve into my research. And it does have relevance in a strangely metaphorical way. It's a kind of brush with the Twilight Zone, if you like. And it happened this spring. I was, my life had gone a bit haywire, actually, and things weren't going so well. So I took off in my little car, and with a bit of camping equipment and that, and just sort of headed off down to the West Country to investigate locations I'd been looking at in my research. So we'll get to this place in my talk, but I thought I'd head off to one particular place which is very relevant to the current time, which is a henge that's sacred to the pole star of Ursa Minor, which is our current pole star, Polaris. And so I found my way using Google Maps, and I eventually found it, middle of nowhere, and I located it, and I set off from my car, leaving all my kit behind, and I climbed quite a considerable hill. And on the top of the hill, I found a really deep channeled ditch, an old biform earthwork henge. And it's full of trees and detritus of all sorts, leaves and mess. And I sort of started to walk about. I thought, wow, this is like, no one's been here for years. And I picked up this piece of old stag oak. I don't know if you've come across stag oak, when you see old oaks sort of lose their bark. And there was this piece of stag oak. I picked that up. Great, okay. I was walking around, and it all seemed really amazing. The trench was really deep, about 50 foot, I reckon, and completely, I've never heard of this place, apart from out of my research. And there was a badger's skull, so I picked that up. I thought, wow, it's like I'm finding this stuff that seems to relate to me. A badger's very like a bear to me. I know that they're not actually a bear species at all. They're related to polecat, but anyway, it was good enough. It was a skull and a stick. I sort of wandered around, and then I thought I'd go to the center of this henge, where I thought, well, maybe originally there was maybe a structure here or something. So I went out to the middle of the plateau. It's quite a high plateau surrounded by this trench. And I plunged the stick in the ground, and I hung the skull on the top of it. And I thought, well, I'm going to talk to the gods. I said, hey, this is your henge. This relates to now. This is the henge of now. This is where we need to greet the sun on the midsummer solstice. And I waited. And it was really quiet. And the clouds just scudded across. Nothing. Okay. Right, so I went over to, is that still working? I went over to a small lake, and quite a small lake, actually. It's got trees around it. And the surface of the lake was shimmering. And in the reflection, I could see the trees as a sort of opposite world. You know how sometimes you look into water and you feel that you're almost looking into the underworld in a strange way. And I bent down, and I thought, wow, this is really weird. And I slid my hands under the water, and there was the surface was shimmering. And I felt like this is like entering the underworld. I'm sliding my hands into the slimy goo under there, and I thought, wow, this is pretty cold and not very nice. And I retreated and shook my hands, and I sat there for a bit. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I carried on. I went back to my car, and it was dusk, and the road winding through Wiltshire, beautiful countryside, but it was getting late. So I pulled in at a pub. Well, it's like a pub at the end of the universe, really. Very, very sort of, I don't know where I am. So I just went in and I ordered some food from the barman, who gave me a long, steady sort of look. And I said, I'll have a pint of your best, please, and sat down. And I sort of was listening to conversations. I saw Billy No Mates sitting there, rather sort of a bit of a sore thumb. Anyway, I nursed my pint as long as I felt I could, ate my food, and I thought, well, I suppose I better find somewhere to sleep. So looking on Google Earth, there was this little pathway. Oh, okay. So I got my tent and my sleeping bag, and I went off down this path. And it slowly descended. The moon was out now, and it was dark, and the landscape, as my eyes became accustomed to the dark, was beautiful, sort of ethereal, that sort of greeny hue that the moon brings to the countryside. You can see it all, but you can't quite see colors. And I went past a gate with some dogs that were going, really aggressive. I thought, okay, it's fine. I'm just going past. And then I came to the edge of some steps. So I descended the steps, 40, 50 steps. And then I was in this sort of marshy territory, and it was squelchy, and I was treading around, and I came across, after one field, I came to some more steps. I went down further, and the landscape spread out, and the moon was beautiful. And I thought, all right, okay. So I pitched my tent, and I tried to get some sleep. And it was very cold, and the moon was blasting through my tent, which was only a little festival tent. And so, yeah, I couldn't sleep. About 3 o'clock in the morning, oh God, it's only 3 o'clock. Oh God. No sleep. What am I going to do? I know. I'll go to Stonehenge, I thought. Right, that's not far. So I went back to my car and I ascended all the steps back up to where I'd left it in the pub car park. And I drove off and I got to Stonehenge quite quickly. It's only about 10 minutes drive. And I pulled off the A30. I thought, wow. I shouldn't be doing this. But hey, so I threw myself over the fence, which has got barbed wire at the top. It's quite a tricky thing to do without ripping something off. And so I gathered myself together, and it was really dark. There was nothing for miles. And approaching Stonehenge was coming closer. And then there was a truck. And I lay down in the grass. And nobody saw me, right? And the truck went past. And then, all right, okay. Started towards Stonehenge again. It came closer and closer. And then a light came on in Stonehenge. And it started searching the countryside. Oh dear, it's guarded. Of course it's guarded. So turned around, legged it back to the car, leapt over the fence, jumped in my car, and I drove about a mile before I turned the headlights on. But I could see, but, nobody could see me, right? So, anyway, I turned the headlights on. This is fine. Anyway, later that morning, I did actually get into Stonehenge with my National Trust membership card. So I didn't need to have done that little exercise, but it was fun. Anyway, I'm going to start to talk about Stonehenge now, and you'll see how that has a strange metaphorical resonance to what I'm going to be talking about. Okay, so Stonehenge and the lost axis of the Immortals. So, we know about the Glastonbury Zodiac, Andy just mentioned it, and that's one that was, that little wooden thing is one that was made by Catherine Maltwood. It's rather like a sort of wonderful table setting, isn't it, for the Knights of the Round Table. And anyway, that's well known, and it's in this locality. And so it was actually, as a kid, I remember my mother was a member of RILCO, the Research into Lost Knowledge organization. And I looked at her map, and I was always turning it around. I can't make it out. Anyway, something went in, something very important for me. And I later on got this sort of fascination. I wanted to know about the possibility of the heavens reflected on the ground. And if you remember, I think it was Graham Hancock produced this book about the pyramids reflecting the stars of Orion's belt, and he did a great documentary. That was the halcyon days, apparently, of documentaries. But as I looked into it, I was looking at Norwich at the time, and Norwich is a very good zodiac. The street system is laid out very well as a sort of as a zodiac, very comprehensively, and I made a big chart of it. I thought, oh, great. So I looked at other cities around Europe. Cities did seem to be laid out in astrological ways. And I found how there were ancient traditions of making talisman cities that were to bring beneficial powers to the people and populace. The populace and the actions in the cities. And just, people would think of it as Jerusalem. The sky was sort of Jerusalem. So this is the sort of thing I was looking at in the early days. It's a sort of it's the net of stars, and I was trying to understand what it really meant to be constellations. I was a real beginner with this. And I was charting the stars myself, and I would go out in the dark with a glinty sort of gold pen, and I'd try and draw the relationships of the stars on a black drawing book. And so that was always quite difficult. And the more I found out about it, the more I realized there was a sort of scheme that was traditional. And this is a more 17th century, apparently, star chart, which, as you can see, it gives the 12 constellations around the outside, sort of ecliptic, and you've got all the northern constellations centrally. And so the northern hemisphere is always considered to be the location of heaven, if you like. So it's the heavenly Jerusalem. And so I learnt to chart my way around the constellations quite successfully. And that was also paralleled by the way I was charting my way around cities and towns and landscapes. And there are quite a few astrological landscapes. So I looked at Egypt. I was curious about Egypt. And I found this little thing from Hermes Trismegistus. He said, "Do you not know, Asclepius, that Egypt is an image of heaven? Or to speak more exactly, in Egypt, all the operations of the powers which rule and work in heaven have been transferred to the earth below. Nay, it should rather be said that the whole cosmos dwells in our land as in its sanctuary." Now, I think he was really referring to the fact that the whole Nile Delta actually operates as a zodiacal pattern. Now, this is the Zodiac of Dendro, which was in the Temple of Dendro in the ceiling, and it's actually in the Louvre, and this is a drawing of it. And I found that it fitted the landscape beautifully. And what you can see in this photograph, just underneath the trace paper, you can see the aircraft chart that I used to plot the zodiac. And I transferred the constellations across. And I thought, yeah, that really works. So, in fact, it's about 200 miles across and about 200 miles deep. And it's an enormous zodiacal pattern, but it's not in the same tradition as our more Greco-Roman sort of tradition. So coming to the Stonehenge Zodiac, I was really curious about Stonehenge, like everybody is. You know, what do we know about Stonehenge? Pretty much nothing. It's been mute. Archaeologists look at it. So many archaeologists have picked it apart and tried to date it. And it kind of stands there like a sort of... Nobody can really understand it. It seems just mute. And everybody wonders at it and scratches their heads over it. So I thought, let's have a look. Is it part of an astrological landscape? And indeed it was part of a very, very considerable landscape. And this is a snapshot of the maps laid out on the floor. And there's only 6 in this shot, but there are actually 16 maps. Ordnance Survey, I think it's 1 to 50,000 Land Ranger style maps. And what I did is I painted them in with a wash of white to make the map paler, and I drew around the edge. And I thought, well, that brings it up a bit for my purposes anyway. And as I worked, I plotted my way from constellation to constellation, because they all have a relative relationship. You know, they're not in isolation. You can go, oh, that's the shape of a swan, so that's that. But actually, around the swan are other constellations that relate to it. So it's quite easy, using a traditional chart, to correspond the two. And I found that Stonehenge was, the landscape around Stonehenge was quite difficult. It didn't seem to work like other constellations, zodiacs I'd found. It was more spread out. And this is Sagittarius, which I put. This is a small detail from a Renaissance painting, which I'll come to in a minute. But there was Sagittarius, and the garland, and in fact, and just to the right there, you can see the foot of Ophiuchus, and there he is, Ophiuchus, who is. Some people say he's the 13th constellation, because his foot bridges the ecliptic, which is the path of the sun and the moon and the constellations of the 12. And so that was really interesting, but it was more open. It wasn't the usual sort of tight-knit pattern that one would expect. That's Virgo. And I think that's Winchester, or at the bottom of her foot there. And this is where I found Stonehenge. So Stonehenge is at the lower corner of the lyre of Orpheus's tail. So this is the lyre as it was depicted in this particular painting. And indeed, is reflected again in the Stonehenge landscape. So if you look at the lower part of the image on the left, you can see Stonehenge is just where that little fork is. I don't know if you can make that out. I was thinking, there's a Google map with Stonehenge marked at the bottom, and if I press that button, you can see where the actual constellation seems to appear. And that gives you an idea of how it appears in the landscape. Although looking at a Google map, and drawing it in as it is in reality is slightly different. But it is definitely the constellation of Lyre. So in the constellation of Lyre is a star called Vega, which is a very, very, very bright star. I think it's even the brightest star in the sky. Now, the thing about Vega is it was, in fact, a pole star a long time ago, 12,000 years ago. And so that was really interesting. So this is Cetus, and just up there you can see on the Ordnance Survey map, you can see Taurus just here, and Taurus's eye is Glastonbury Tor. Yeah, so maybe that's why it was called Tor. I know it's spelled differently, but it's quite interesting that it didn't seem to have much relationship to Catherine Maltwood's view of her zodiac, so I've never really tried to net them together. But this is the dragon's head, Draco, and corresponds with Avebury. So Avebury arrives inside the dragon's head. And this is Bootes, who, if you can look at the map, the difficulty with this is trying to, rather than filling in the whole constellation with painting, just to sort of give an idea of where it lies in the landscape. And so I've penciled around the edge and given a bit of a wash in the middle, so you can get a sense of where it may be. And by looking at the picture, you can relate it. And this is how it appears by laying the actual figure of Bootes onto the landscape. Very accurately done if you have the time enough to spend to pick apart the maps, the Google Maps themselves. That's the swan, and very beautiful and very relevant to something I discovered, which I'll be telling you about. So again, I tried to stretch the swan because the Google Earth image here isn't directly on, it's at a slight angle. So I distorted the picture and dropped it on. And by making it go invisible, you can get a sense of a swan in that landscape. And if you look at the very top, a village called Eddington lies where the tail is, and very, very near to where Deneb, the star, which was in fact another pole star. So this is just above Glastonbury. This is Orion, as he appears. Now, some of these constellations were back to front. The traditional way of illustrating constellations is, in fact, as though you were looking through them to the Earth. So from behind them. So it makes things back to front. So sometimes, it becomes a bit confusing. And again, this is Glastonbury. You can see the bull in the map in relationship to the lamb, Aries, of course. So the bull's eye there as Glastonbury Tor. And this is, this is, I think it's called Delphinius. It's a dolphin. And it was, if I turn that off again, you can almost see that dolphin clearly. If I turn it back on and off, you get it. I've actually followed the lines very faithfully to allow the image to come out. So it does take some time to get used to seeing these images in the landscape. And I don't really expect people to get that too closely. Do you want the laser pointer? Oh, that might be useful. Thank you. Okay, so Delphinius. Now, I was really curious about this Stonehenge landscape. I wanted to know how old it was. How could I date it? And I was kind of stuck. I didn't know how to get a date on it. And I looked at the constellations at the edge of the zodiac, And it did seem that they'd been redrawn in several different stages. Looking at Sagittarius, there was a younger Sagittarius, a sort of adolescent Sagittarius, and an old Sagittarius that was sort of aging. And I thought, yeah, well, maybe they knew about precession. And maybe they redrew the constellation as they worked through precession. So as they made this chart in the landscape, they traditionally perhaps made these pathways to fit with precession. And as the age grew older and came to its end and died, it was like the actual constellation had died. But they remained there and were allowed to be left as they moved on to the next constellation. So now precession is a process. And I'm going to have to take you through it, I'm afraid. And, just before I move on to that, this is not a constellation. This is an elephant that appears near Stonehenge, and I thought it was so sweet. And actually, some of these images overlap each other, so they're quite hard to pick out. But as an art lecturer, I used to teach students to draw sometimes on the same piece of paper all morning, and I'd be able to see their drawings through other drawings. So it was, it was an exercise in observation. It wasn't about producing a good drawing. So if you look here, the shape of that tusk. Now that was a Gomphotherium, I can tell from the shape of the tusk, and that died out in the last ice age. So there's an image that looks suspiciously like an elephant right by Stonehenge, which actually is in just there, where that green light is now, is where Stonehenge appears. And I found actually this is a consistent element of a lot of henges, that they do have an elephant next to them. Now, it's a funny thing to talk about, people go, oh yeah, well what's that got to do with astrology? I don't really know. So this is the Caparelli Ceiling, and this was a complete treasure to find, because in fact what's going on here is that the ecliptic follows, which is the path of the sun and the moon and the main 12 constellations, it follows an S shape through the painting. It's painted in 1500s in Italy, and it was a unique piece, and nobody's sure who painted it. But it gave me the perfect clue to discover the Stonehenge Zodiac, because this was why it was a lot more open. It was actually following this plan to the detail. Every single detail, as it's portrayed in this chart, is the same in the landscape. So that was pretty useful. And that's why I've used them as a reference. Now, Stonehenge being about there, pretty central, so you can imagine it stretches pretty much all the way to London and all the way to the coast. It's flipping enormous. And there are constellations in the middle here which relate to the pole star. Now, the pole star takes a path through a series of constellations here. So this one, it would have been Vega in the lyre. Then it would have moved on to Hercules, who's depicted upside down here. Then it would have moved to Draco the dragon. And then it would have moved on to the bear, who's almost invisible in this particular slide. And then to Cepheus, who's there in his crown. And then on to Deneb, which is part of the swan. So there's a circle that eternally sweeps over 25,000 years in a repeating pattern. So that's what it looks like in the southern and the northern hemisphere. So if you imagine, this is a sort of a idealized model. You've got a notional pole through the Earth, which is a complete variance to the directions of the compass. In other words, it points down and it points up. You know, this is heavens and hell. This is not about directions on earth. So we've got this processional movement doing this circle of what they call the long year of 25,960 years, all right? That's a hell of a long time, an awful lot longer than any civilization that we know has kept any records or anything. So this is the celestial equator, which is tipped at an angle, and it's along that equator that you might see the sun and the moon, the planets, and the constellations. So the axial pole of the Earth and the sacred workings of immortality. As I say, this is a circle which repeats. So these constellations, although they lose their relevance, become relevant again over vast stretches of time. And there is, as a diagram, you can see it related to the ages as they passed. And we are currently at Ursa Minor. And within a few thousand years, it will have moved on to Cepheus. And it moves at the rate of about 1 degree every 72 years. So given there's 360 degrees in a circle, etc., you know, slowly tracking its way round. So I reasoned, in fact, there must be other henges that are really important to the pole star, because, of course, Stonehenge was a pole star. So, in a way, that's only one. There must be at least 6 henges altogether. So that dates Stonehenge to 12,000 years ago. Okay, so what about the next place? Let's have a look. I'm jumping ahead. Sorry. Pulling back a moment. I've called it the Temple of Shadows because I feel that Stonehenge really relates to the myth of Orpheus. Now, the myth of Orpheus, as you probably know, is, and I'll just trot through it really quickly, Orpheus, a poet who's loved by the gods, given his lyre by Apollo, falls in love with the beautiful Eurydice, who sadly is bitten by a snake and dies. And she falls into the underworld. And Orpheus is so destroyed by her death that he decides he will go into the underworld and he will ask personally with song if he could bring her soul back to life. And so he descends into the underworld and he finds his way to Pluto and Persephone, and he plays them a beautiful song. And he says, please let my Eurydice come back to the world of living. And they relent. They're so touched by the beauty of his song. They say, yeah, okay, you can take her, but should you look back at any point before you reach the land of the living, she'll be lost forever. And so Orpheus ascends the long staircase back to the light. And he can hear Eurydice behind him. He can even smell her breath. And he ascends, and he can't wait to see his love again. And just as he reaches the doorway to life, he turns, and she's forever lost into the shadows. So I'm thinking of Stonehenge as a temple to shadow. So it's a totally different way of thinking about Stonehenge. We think about its solidity. We think about it as a massive sculptural thing. We're so preoccupied with dragging the stones around. Let's try it, lads. You know, let's drag these stones. Can we bring them from Wales? All those sort of issues. But what about the space that's not there? What about the subtle play of light? We're talking about a temple of shadows. And I started to play with Stonehenge on Photoshop and bringing out, I've discovered this method of bringing out stone photographs, if you like. And what you can do with ancient stones is putting them into Photoshop. You can develop them. You can literally, as in the old developing method, you used to burn it in with light. So you've actually got a tool in Photoshop you can burn in. It's very sensitive, and it brings up images. So I've realized that Stonehenge is actually illustrated. There are pictures in Stonehenge. And there's one on the left of this, just here, this guy. He's got horns. This is his rib cage, and he's part shadow. These are his legs. Right. So here he is. That's quite a significant character. I can see his horns. Can you see him too? No? Okay. There's one here, which is very subtle. You can see there's a strange figure here. I don't quite know what it is, but it's pictorial. And there's another one here. There's a figure here raising hands with offering. You have to look very carefully. You have to spend time to find these things. But more importantly are the shadows. And that shadow is a figure. And here's one without a head. But I think that the shadows are really important in Stonehenge. And one could spend a lot of time looking at the shadows if you wanted to know more about Stonehenge. And what I found that day, coming back to my little story, after I was let into Stonehenge with my National Trust card, I wandered round and I came to the heel stone. And I looked at this and I thought, well, of course, it's Orpheus. Orpheus is returning from the land of the dead. And this is his back, and he's looking over his shoulder like this. And I realized, there he is. He's actually half still in the underworld. So the heel stone gives me Orpheus and relates Stonehenge directly to the date I've picked out as being relevant for Stonehenge, which is 12,000 years ago. Whether the stones were there or not, it doesn't really matter. The point is that it relates to Orpheus. So there he is, looking over his shoulder. So that's a shot of my map. And here's the eagle as I drew it in, with white lines on suggested indications in the Google Maps. Quite different. Okay, so Hercules, between 10,000 and 8,500 before the present, the Temple of the Warrior. And this is the henge. It's a biform ditch way out on Salisbury Plain. It's called Sidbury Hill, and I explored that. It's pretty derelict, but beautiful woodland in the middle, and an ancient yew, and a fantastic view of Salisbury Plain. And that's a star that appears in the landscape really near, and that would be equivalent to the lion's skin that hangs over the knee of Hercules. So that would have been a henge after Stonehenge. Perhaps they couldn't actually move Stonehenge itself. Perhaps it was built at a much, much earlier date. So Hercules, and that's where he appears in the landscape. I've dropped him in as a photograph. And the henge is somewhere about there. Okay, so on from Hercules to Avebury. So the pole star moves on to Alpha Draconis, and it gives a perfect reason for Avebury's creation and the Temple of the Dragon. So we've got the biggest earth mound in Europe, and we've got this wonderful henge, a lot of it destroyed in the 17th century by a character called Stonekiller Robinson or something. very, very destructive, but there's still enough there to know that it was a vitally important henge. And there's the Google Earth image for you. There's the mound, and there's Avebury. And sorry, I went back then. There's the dragon's head, where it would appear within that boundary. So, coming to Whitton Ditch, Ursa Minor, the little bear, the current pole star henge, all right? This is where we should be greeting the summer solstice, not really at Stonehenge. That'll piss a lot of people off. But, so, oh, I've gone backwards. Sorry, it's my methods here. Okay, so there's the bear. Bears don't have long tails, so this is a mythical bear. And just up there, you can see the henge, which is, I picked it out for you on the Google Maps. And it was here that my story began today, with the trench around this amazing plateau. And it doesn't give you any idea of the size and scale of this henge, which is considerable. And it's actually on private land. I was kicked off later that day. But yeah, there's a road that bisects it, and there's a little lake there that I was telling you about. So onto the Cepheus, and the Cepheus Henge. I mean, Melksham means the king's city, and it makes a bit of sense now when you know they're actually right at the feet of Cepheus. And there he is, as he appears in my chart. And there's the traditional Caparelli Ceiling painting. And that is as he lies in the landscape. And if you look just up here, you can see this is the Cepheus Henge. I'm going to go into it closer. You can see the circular woodland with a lake at the center. And I did visit this location. It's a very brackish sort of lake and another neglected henge. But there it is. That's the Cepheus Henge. And that would have been the pole star, I don't know, what, 20,000 years ago? A very, very long time ago. Yeah, probably before the Ice Age. Anyway, Eddington, Cygnus, and the star Deneb, which was also a pole star. And here in the landscape, my drawing, as it appears to me. And there's the tail, and you can see this feathering of the tail, which is very clearly intended to be a bird's tail. And I would say this is probably the location of the henge, probably. It's got some deep rifts in the soil there. I've spent some time looking around, and this whole area is a wonderful valley, and it would be perfect for making shadows. There it is, a bit more close up. So I've put into my talk a little bit about how I think the henges may have worked. And I do think they're to do with shadows. And here's why. Now, shadow is what happens when you... This henge is in Norfolk, actually. It's near where I live. And I was there a couple of years ago, standing on the inner ditch wall here with my wife, and the sun was low, and we were playing with the shadows. We were just sort of making shapes and faces, and we just realized this is really weird. It's so immersive. When you raise your hand, your shadow waves back. This is really, maybe this is what was going on. And I realized that actually Avebury In fact, all the henges have got a biform ditch, including Stonehenge. And that's Stonehenge without the stones. And they think that the biform ditch was probably there before the stones were moved there. I think it would have to be to successfully create a circle. So perhaps it's about shadows. And that's me and my wife creating shadows across this channel, which is filled with the deepest, blackest shadow. And it really gives you a strange quality, because directly behind you, of course, is the sun, behind your shadow, which makes a sort of luminous quality in the chalk surface, and giving you a sort of impression of luminosity around your altar self. And I could imagine that there were all sorts of dramas that could be played out along these walls. And we had a lot of fun playing with that idea. But it did make me think, perhaps that is what was going on originally. So just briefly, the Andromeda star fields are a collection of constellations. I've called them this. I kind of like the idea of them all having a relationship. This is Cepheus, and as I've drawn him in, he's a seated figure, and that's his crown with the henge that I was talking about, and an orb of power and a bird in that hand, and his feet are just there. So Cepheus is the key figure in the myth of Andromeda. I suppose I should cover that too, just very briefly. There was, I think it was what happened was Cassiopeia, Andromeda's mother, angered the Nereids, who were the daughters of a Titan, and she said, "Oh, we're more beautiful," and you know, anyway, and that's hubris, and that really pissed them off, and they went to talk to Poseidon, and they said, you know, this is not on. Can you do something about it? And Poseidon says, sure, I'll despoil their landscape. So he sends a whale, and the whale sort of, you know, sends huge waves across the shore. And there's Andromeda. So the king Cepheus, he goes to consult the oracle, and he says, what should I do? My landscape's been destroyed. They said, you've got to placate the gods. You've got to tie your daughter up to the coast and let the whale eat her. Well, he didn't want to, of course. And so, but he did, because the people said, well, you've got to. Otherwise, you know, we'll all be lost. So tie your daughter, chain her to the coast. And so Cepheus did. And then along comes Perseus. Oh, sorry. That's Andromeda. And that's a flint I found near Stonehenge, actually. I thought that was very feminine. So here is Perseus in the landscape, coming to the rescue of Andromeda. He was passing in the Argo, and he made a deal with Cepheus. He says, look, I'll save your daughter if I can marry her. So they said, yeah, fine. Just save her. So he takes to the air on his winged sandals, and he scared the whale off. And then, of course, everything's rejoicing, and there's a marriage. And but while they're getting married, there's the whale. There are, in fact, 2 whales in this landscape. There's another one just here. So don't know why there's 2. Maybe they drew it twice in different places. And so while Perseus is celebrating, suddenly over the horizon come 200 men, broad and brave, with Phineus, who's an ex-suitor of Andromeda's, and he's saying, I'm not having Perseus getting married to my beloved. And so Perseus thinks, well, I've got the Gorgon's head in my pocket, and he pulls it out. And they're all turned to stone, strangely enough. It kind of gives you a nice little reason for Stonehenge being there, doesn't it? 200 stones about thereabouts. Anyway, this is the Gorgon. And please don't turn to stone. Otherwise you won't be able to have your tea break. Yeah, so the Gorgon, as he appears in the landscape, actually really visible without my drawing. So now here comes the tricky bit. I was experimenting with the Mayan calendar. And there it is. That's a pristine version of it, re-sculpted to exact research. And that's how it would have looked intact. It's now rather damaged. It's a 25-ton stone that was found lying face down in a square in Tenochtitlan, I think, Mexico City. Anyway, yeah, it apparently relates to, these little squares relate to ages that have come and gone. Mass extinctions, if you like, ages of the Earth. They're called Olin. And there are 4, with a 5th portrayed by the whole insignia in the middle. Now, I was looking at that, and I thought, I don't know what makes me do these sort of things, but I trialed it over Tenochtitlan, the lost city of the Incas. I thought, what happens when I drop this image over and scale it and then make it transparent? And I realized, actually, it makes that city, it makes sense of it. In fact, it's a map of it. Nobody's really realized this, that is, in fact, it's quite practically a map of Tenochtitlan. So I thought, well, what happens if I drop it into the landscape where Stonehenge is? I don't know what makes me do these sort of wildcard experiments. It's a hunch, if you like. And this is what happened when I did. Here's Stonehenge, the landscape. And Stonehenge is positioned exactly where the green light is there. And I could see that there was another thing like a little woodland just about there. Okay. And there's this sort of tongue-like shape. And there's a lot of other forms, eroded, but nonetheless there, lines in the landscape that gave me a way of scaling the calendar over Stonehenge. And here's what happens when I drop it in. It actually fits really, really well. And you can see very subtle indications in the actual soil of the nose and eye there. And I'm very confident that, in fact, that was the calendar that was laid into the landscape at the time of building Stonehenge. So, there it is. And it's strange that it relates to something from South America. But I've found that repeated at every single henge. It does work at every single henge, and not just the Stonehenge Zodiac, but other zodiacs. I've got one in Norfolk that's a circle, and it does the same thing. So, coming back to Orpheus, there he is. And I was thinking about Orpheus, and I was thinking, do you know what? He's still half in the underworld. He's still immersed in the soil. And I realized, well, that means it's actually here. The underworld is still here, because it must still be here in some way. How can I see that? It's the opposite of the world. I've heard that it's been depicted in Egypt as being the opposite. And so I thought, right, well, let me try all this. Let's have a go at this. Let's put the image of Stonehenge into reverse. Put it upside down. Ah, yeah. So something a bit magic happened here. And I was thinking about Perseus and his fight with the Medusa and the shield, and how he could only see the Medusa with the shield. And I realized that, in fact, Stonehenge resides half in the underworld. We only see the part that is in our world, the present world of the living. The other half is actually in the land of the dead, in the land of the Immortals. And this is what happens when you put it upright and make it into a totem, as I did. And I realized that, in fact, it's an extraordinary totem. You've got this beast with its tongue sticking out, like the Gorgon, like Tonatiuh in the Mayan calendar. And you've got it 3 times. You've got the face on, you've got the side view with the tongue, which appears to be doing that, and the reverse, because it's mirrored. And then I started to play with this image, and I inverted it, and I got a masculine version. Here's a masculine character with his mouth agape and his tongue out. And just under here, amongst his beard, is quite a demonic-looking character. But above it, I identified Isis Hathor, who is an infigurement of Isis as a cow. She was nutritive element. She was symbolic of, well, I can't talk to you guys. You probably know all about that. But there's also quite a strange grotesque here. So I started to play with all the images I had taken that morning that I described to you of Stonehenge.
5 minutes, yeah.
Thank you. And here's what I came up with. This guy, his name escapes me, but he looks like Baphomet. I think that's it, Baphomet. Quite Baphomet-like. And as a counterpoise, perhaps a female version, birthing. These are just suggestions. And I've printed in my book all these photographs as big as I could get them. And if you take the trouble to buy my book, plug, you will have a chance there to sit and ponder these, because I believe this is actually quite possibly what Stonehenge is really about. It's a sculpture that lies in the landscape. Here is a very stylized skull in the middle. And this could be Thoth, a monkey, baboon-like figure. Bull-like, I'm not sure. They're quite highly stylized. And this one, I've called this one Mata Durga. Mata Durga is the Hindu mother goddess, all right? I know it doesn't seem to relate to Stonehenge at all, but I don't know. This is a tiger. To me, it's a tiger. It's got saber tooth, possibly. It's quite highly stylized. And those are rooks, by the way, flying past Stonehenge the moment I took the photograph. And this is an inverted version, and you can see a dark female figure in the middle here. And I see that as Kali. Mata Durga has another incarnation as Kali, and it's a more wrathful god. So it's quite weird to find Hindu symbolism, but you know, this was before any of this stuff really happened. I can't pull that over, but so in all, this one was I identified as Bastet, a sort of cat-like deity from Egypt. It appears to be a cat with its tongue sticking out, teeth, and very cat-like. To me, it was saying cat. And this is Bastet's counter was her male counterpart was the sun. And here's another figure with a sort of barbed tongue sticking out. So, I don't know, I've lost half of that one off there. I should have kept them all in the center of my slideshow. And that's the last one. And I think that one would need time to ponder those. And, if I just go back to this image, looking across from Stonehenge, this is the woodland, which represents the left eye of Tonatiuh, the god, the sun god. And I was exploring that woodland, and I found a flint. I did a little drawing for you, try and give you the impression of what it looks like to me. And this looks like a figure with its tongue sticking out, like this. And there we are. There are the three main figures, all with their tongues sticking out. I don't know what you make of it. I'm sure we'll all be talking about it for years to come. And for me, it's definitely what Stonehenge really is hiding. Possibly lots more. But anyway, that's the end of my talk. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Fionn Rawnsley.